Hello, welcome to our REACHLaw webinar on UK REACH Authorisation. Next slide, please. So this is going to be about an hour. Next slide, please. I'd like to present myself. My name is Steve George. I'm a Director and Senior Advisor with REACHLaw UK, and I'd like to introduce our Head of Authorisation Practice, Bernadette. Please introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. I'm Bernadette Quinn, and I'm the lead for authorization services here at REACHLaw. Welcome to the webinar.
Thank you. So next slide, please. So a little bit of practical information. We are going to turn off our video cameras once we get into the presentation itself, just to improve your bandwidth. Please ask any questions via the chat function. We aim to get through fairly quickly, and we'll get to your questions as soon as possible. We are going to go quite fast. This is a busy topic, but we want to respect your diaries and keep to time as far as is possible. If you want to talk to us later, we will be at the Chemical Watch Conference on the 6th of December in London, and you can find our booth there. So we hope to see you in London. Next slide, please. So a quick overview of REACHLaw, some background and overview of authorization under UK REACH and how it's governed. Then I'll pass over to Bernadette for the expert detail, and then we'll just quickly summarize and we'll get into Q&A. So that's roughly the outline of today. Next. So REACHLaw in brief. Next. We provide services in a number of locations, founded in Helsinki, Espoo. We now have sites in New Delhi, in Istanbul, in Brussels, and in Manchester, UK, providing a range of services around the globe for chemical management. Next. Our authorization services are in the UK essentially the same as they are under EU REACH, and we provide the range of services you see on the screen. Next. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel and have access to a lot of our webinar material there, and add various talking points, and you'll find lots of free information that we hope can be of help. Next, please. And of course, this is a standard disclaimer. Please use this material under advisement, and obviously do your own research. We're not going to take any liability for anything we say, so please seek any appropriate legal advice as appropriate for your circumstances. Thank you. Next slide, please. So, authorization under UK REACH, a bit of background and overview. Next, please. So what is authorization? Well, it is the A of REACH, registration, evaluation, authorization, restriction of chemicals. The system is largely the same as it was for the EU, as at the 31st of December 2020. We have to put that stake in the ground because, of course, the EU is reviewing its system right now. REACH requires that the substances on Annex 14, the authorization list, cannot be used as a substance or mixture unless that application for that use is authorized. The authorization must be held by either the user of the chemical or their upstream supplier. Users operating under an authorization held upstream must notify the agency. That's known as an Article 66 notification. An application, you can also continue to use the chemical if an application has been made before the latest application date, typically 18 months before the sunset date, but it has not yet been decided. Or you can continue use if the sunset date has not yet been reached, of course. Some exceptions: if the substance is concentration less than 0.1% weight by weight in a mixture, then it does not fall within authorization. If the use is an intermediate only, that the only use is to be converted into another substance, then it is outside the scope of authorization. And if essentially it has already been included as part of an article, so the uses of an article rather than use as a substance or mixture, then that is not included in authorization. Next slide, please. Substances requiring authorization. Well, first step is to identify them on the so-called candidate list for authorization. That is done by the agency as a result of the following properties. They may be carcinogenic, mutagenic, reprotoxic, category 1, very persistent or very bioaccumulative, persistent, bioaccumulative and toxic, and also substances with an equivalent level of concern, such as, for example, endocrine disrupting properties. Once substances are on the candidate list, then communication obligations are initiated. So they must be disclosed in safety data sheets where they are greater than 0.1% weight by weight for substances and mixtures. And for articles, there is an obligation to provide safe use information in accordance with Article 33 of REACH, as a minimum the name of the substance. Candidate list substances may be prioritized for authorization list inclusion in 2 steps. First of all, there's a recommendation by the agency, and then inclusion in Annex 14 has to be decided by the Secretary of State for DEFRA, which is the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. And because environmental matters are devolved matters, he has to get the consent of devolved administrations in Scotland and Wales. Next slide, please. Because the UK came out of the EU, certain things had to be managed to make sure that the supply chains did not fall apart or get completely confused as a result of authorization considerations in the EU, confusing the situation in the UK. So, on EU exit, certain transitional provisions came into force. Number 1, the ECHA candidate list, as at December 2020, was transposed into UK REACH. So the UK REACH candidate list, as of that date, was the same as the EU one. The authorization list, Annex 14, was transposed into UK REACH. Existing latest application dates and sunset dates did not change, except for some special cases, where if you had an undecided application made in advance of a latest application date, where the latest application date was after the 29th of March 2017, then you got alternative latest application dates and sunset dates. That was to avoid supply chain disruption. Existing decided authorizations, where essentially the European Commission through the REACH Committee had made a decision already, these were grandfathered in, but provision of information to the UK authorities had to be made. Undecided authorizations were resubmitted to UK authorities if they were by Great Britain companies. And downstream users covered by existing upstream EU applications were allowed to have continued use subject to notification. Thereafter, UK REACH for Great Britain entities operates independently of the EU. It's a completely separate system after the 31st of December 2020. Now, EU authorization therefore does not cover use in Great Britain, apart from those transitional protections, and the candidate and authorization lists are gradually diverging. Next slide, please. The authorization application, the dossiers for application must demonstrate a strong case for continued use on an adequate control basis, that is, exposure is much less than derived or appropriate threshold level. This is only available for threshold substances where there is no risk below that threshold. For other chemicals, then only the socio-economic basis is available. And for this, it must be on the basis that there is no available alternative and that socio-economic cost of the non-use scenario greatly exceeds the socio-economic cost of continued use. The dossier contents have to cover an overall summary of the use. What is the substance? How is it used? What is the application sector it is for? It must include an analysis of alternatives, and where alternatives are generally available, then a substitution plan is also required. Also, a chemical safety report, which explains how the substance is used and what protections and exposures are therefore present. And finally, the socio-economic analysis. Next slide, please. I'll now briefly touch on governance before we head into the detail. Next slide, please. So, applications are decided in the following steps. First of all, an application is submitted. There's a technical compliance check, after which a fee is paid. There's a public consultation. There's opinion forming by the agency, which we'll come back to in a moment. There'll be an opportunity for the applicant to comment on an opinion, and then a decision is made, as we'll discuss in a moment. Next slide. Who makes decisions? Well, I'll compare this to the EU. For those familiar with the EU, then this will perhaps help understanding. So an identification of a substance as a substance of very high concern in the EU is made by the European Chemicals Agency with the support of the Member State Committee. In the UK, it is done by the Health and Safety Executive, supported by something I'll come back to in a moment called RICEP. Act 14 entries are legal acts, so ECHA make a recommendation, and the decision is made by the REACH Comitology Committee in the EU. But in the UK, it's the Health and Safety Executive, and the decision is made by the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, Secretary of State, but with the consent of the devolved administrations in Scotland and Wales. And the authorisations are decided on the same basis. So an opinion is made by HSE with a decision by the DEFRA, Secretary of State. Next slide, please. Right, decision making and granting. The UK agency within the Health and Safety Executive performs all functions of ECHA in the EU. It is supported by the so-called REACH Independent Scientific Expert Pool, or RICEP. These are identified experts in the field covering a range of expertises. If that's a word, I apologize if it is not, you get the point. And they are called upon where there is no conflict of interest to support the decision-making process. These draft the UK agency opinion, which is then passed to central government. The Secretary of State for DEFRA makes the final authorisation decisions with the consent of the devolved Wales and Scotland administrations. Now, we don't mention Northern Ireland because Northern Ireland is outside the scope of UK REACH as regards this, because Northern Ireland remains part of the EU system of REACH under the so-called Annex to the trade agreement. Now, the tools for preparing UK REACH authorisation applications will be the same as for the EU at the moment, and dossiers will eventually be submitted by the so-called Comply with UK REACH REACH IT system for the UK. Next slide, please. I'm now going to hand over to Bernadette to get into the detail. Thank you very much, Bernadette.
Okay, thanks, Steve. So now I will continue with an overview of the UK REACH authorization process in practice. So next slide, please. So first to start, a summary of the basic principles. As under EU REACH, authorization is specific for the use of a chemical. So if we look at the supply chain for the chemical, the application to continue use can be submitted by an upstream actor, so for example, the manufacturer of the chemical, to cover specific uses of the chemical down the supply chain. It can also be submitted by a downstream user, and this can be a formulator or an end user to cover their own specific uses. Applications can be submitted individually or jointly. So as Steve has already said, as with EU REACH, the application process is quite heavy. It requires the applicant to submit very detailed information on the technical function of the chemical in the use, the availability of alternatives, a very detailed assessment of exposure to relevant populations coming from the use, risk characterization that demonstrates safe use, or a cost-benefit analysis that demonstrates the benefits outweigh the risks from continued use. The applications are processed by the UK HSE, who give their opinion on the application, and then ultimately the decision on granting authorization is taken by the Secretary of State. So next slide, please. So now a quick recap on who could apply for authorization and how the coverage of the authorization depends on where the applicant is on the supply chain. So note that the supply chain is solely from the perspective of the chemical. So this puts the manufacturer and the importer at the top of the supply chain and the end user logically at the end. So manufacturers, importers at the top of the supply chain, so they can apply for some or all uses down their supply chain, from formulation uses to end uses. Downstream users, like formulators, can apply for their own use, their own formulation use, further formulation uses by their customers, for example, and also end users at the end of the supply chain. At the end of the supply chain, we have the end users, and they can apply for their own uses, but they cannot cover with their application uses upstream from them. So, for example, they cannot cover uses by their formulator suppliers. It's also important to remember that manufacturers and importers have no use in the context of authorization, and therefore they don't need to apply for authorization. However, they can only supply the chemical for authorized uses or uses that are exempt from the authorization requirement. So these basically give the actors involved. Next slide, please. So on this slide, I share our observations on how the UK REACH authorisation process has been running since UK REACH came into force on the 1st of January 2021. So now that's almost 2 years ago. So our experience so far with applications that were grandfathered into UK REACH and also with applications submitted under transitional arrangements has been very positive. The UK HSC has been very helpful to the applicants, and the process runs well with few delays. We see that in terms of the mechanics of the process. At the moment, there is no dedicated IT system for submission or communication, but so far this hasn't hindered the process. In terms of the numbers of applications submitted, we see that the numbers submitted were quite low, but they have been increasing since the end of the transitional period after the entry into force, so that was June this year, and the expiry of review periods for authorisations that were grandfathered into UK REACH. You can find the complete list of applications submitted and their status on the UK HSC website. And I've given the link on the page. Next slide, please. So next, I will give you an overview of the application process. So the 4 steps are given in the schematic on this slide. For those of you familiar with the EU REACH process, you will see that the application process is very similar, with some differences that Steve outlined in terms of who does the assessment. In this case, it's going to be a designated team, a case team from the UK HSC, and there are no committees involved in either opinion making or decision taking. It is a complex process involving many actors, so in the next slides, we will give some more details of what happens in each step. Next slide, please. So this slide gives more details on the actors and the actions to be taken by them in each process step. So the first process step is the preparation of the application. So this is with the applicant. So this involves the preparation of the detailed reports, typically 3, the analysis of alternatives, chemical safety report, and socioeconomic analysis, depending on whether or not the chemical is a threshold or a non-threshold substance, and their submission in the format of an application to the UK HSC. So as I said, all action is with the applicant at this stage. So step 2 starts once the application has been submitted to the UK HSC. So this is the assessment part where the application reports are evaluated by the UK HSC team. They will give their opinion on whether authorization may be granted. They will base their opinion on the report submitted, answers to questions they may ask the applicant, comments submitted during the public consultation on the availability of alternatives. Their draft opinion will be scrutinised by a challenge panel composed of members of the RICEP, and the purpose of the challenge panel is to provide independent assurance that the agency has undertaken an appropriate and robust evaluation of the application for authorization. So step 2 ends with the UK HSC issuing their final opinion on the application to the DEFRA Secretary of State for decision making. In step 3, the Secretary of State takes the decision on granting the authorization, and then finally in step 4, the decision is issued to the applicant, who then becomes an authorization holder. The decision and public versions of all of the application reports and the opinion are available on the UK HSE website. The decision, of course, is also available will also be available on the UK government website. So in the next slide, we will look at the timelines post-submission. How long does it take for this process to run? Next slide, please. So this slide shows the timelines post-submission. So this is the part of the process that the applicant cannot influence. It is determined by how the process runs and the time needed for the assessment, for opinion making and decision taking. And during the application stage, the timelines are determined by how quickly the applicant can prepare the application reports. So the timelines post-submission, this basically gives the processing time needed to get the authorization decision from submission to decision. So the green boxes give the key stages the applicant is involved in. So we have the pre-submission meeting with the UK HSE case team, the document check and paying the invoice, replying to questions from the UK HSE case team, participating in a stakeholder consultation meeting if it's organized by the case team, observing the challenge panel meeting on the case team draft opinion, and then finally commenting on the draft opinion. The red boxes give the timelines after submission, where essentially the clock is running for the UK HSE. Their draft opinion must be issued to the applicant within 10 months after the invoice is paid. Post-submission, it can take 10 to 11 months to receive the draft opinion, and depending on whether the applicant decides to submit comments on the draft, another 1 to 4 months before the opinion becomes final. After the final opinion is issued to the Secretary of State, it can take up to 6 months to have the decision issued to the applicant. So it is quite a long process, and applicants need to factor in processing time, as it will take about 18 months post-submission to get their decision on the application. So this is very important for new applications. I will now give an overview of the key dates to keep in mind if you do need to submit an application for authorization. Next slide, please. So this slide gives info on how to get started preparing a UK REACH authorization application. The slide shows a screenshot from the UK HSE website. It explains that the process is very similar to EU REACH and that the available guidance and templates for the application reports available on the ECHO website may be used. The webpage refers to transitional arrangements after the entry into force of UK REACH and 2 key dates from the perspective of the applicant: the latest application date and the sunset date. So now I will give you some details on these in the next slide. Next slides. Next slide, please. So this slide gives information on the key dates that new applicants and re-applicants need to keep in mind. So if you need to continue use of a chemical already listed on the authorization list, or your supply chain depends on this use, the key dates for your business will depend on the chemical-specific latest application date and sunset date given in the entry on the authorization list. Transitional arrangements if an application was already submitted under EU REACH, but the decision is not yet available. Expiry of review periods for applications that were grandfathered into UK REACH from EU REACH. Information on all possible scenarios is available on the UK HSE website. On the next slides, I will show you where to find the information on these key dates. Next slide, please. So where to find these very important dates? First, we look at the authorization list. So this slide shows a screenshot of the list in the format of an Excel that is available on the UK HSE website. The entries for chromium trioxide, entry 27, and UV 320, entry 54, are shown to illustrate the information available. You will see that each entry has an associated sunset date and a latest application date. The sunset date is the date after which only authorized uses or exempted uses are allowed, and all other uses are not allowed. The latest application date is the date before which an authorization application must be submitted for the applicant to benefit from transitional arrangements. Next slide, please. So next, we look at the key dates if your current use in GB is covered by a grandfathered EU application. Now you need to check the date given for the expiry of the review period given for this authorization. So a quick recap on grandfathered EU authorizations. So these authorizations enable GB-based users to continue use up to the expiry of the review period. If your use is covered by a grandfathered upstream application, you will need to have another authorization in place before the review period expires. Transitional arrangements are only applicable if the authorization holder submits a review report. This is basically a reapplication, 18 months before the expiry of the review period. Applications submitted by all non-authorization holders will not be covered by transitional arrangements. So these users must have their authorization application submitted, processed, and granted before the end of the review period, or they will need to stop use until such time as authorization is granted. So a reminder on what transitional arrangements mean. It's simply that use can continue after the expiry of the review period in the scenario that the Secretary of State has not yet granted authorization by this date. So I will show you in the next slide where to find the expiry dates for these grandfathered applications. Next slide, please. So this slide shows a screenshot of the authorization Excel available on the UK HSE website. There is a tab in the Excel for grandfathered applications. So each grandfathered authorization is listed with links to the decision, and the expiry date is shown, and also the latest date for the authorization holder to submit a review report, i.e. a reapplication, to benefit from these transitional arrangements. So next, I will also show you where to find more information on EU applications that could not be grandfathered as they were still in flight, i.e. a Commission decision was not yet available on January 1st, 2021, when UK REACH came into force. Next slide, please. So this slide gives information on GB uses that were covered by an in-flight EU application on the 1st of January 2021. So for users relying on these applications, an 18-month transition period was given to allow these users to submit their own applications. So they had in effect a combined latest application date and sunset date as of the 30th of June 2022. So it's important to know that many applications were at this process stage under EU REACH. So for example, IBD uses of chemicals covered by entries 42 and 43, and surface treatment uses of hexavalent chromates. This 18-month transition period was given if the EU applications fulfilled specific criteria, and these were dependent on whether the applicant was GB or EU-based and the status of the assessment on the application as of the 1st of January 2021, and of course the date the application was submitted with respect to the latest application date and the sunset date given in the Annex 4 in the authorization list entry for the chemical. So to note, as the 18 months has now passed, your use will need to be covered by a UK REACH application submitted before the end of the 18-month period to legally be allowed to continue your use. So this is important. The transition period has in fact ended. So on the next slide, I will show you where to find information on applications submitted under these transitional arrangements. So next slide, please. So this slide shows a screenshot from the authorization Excel available on the UK HSE website. So there's a tab in the Excel for submitted applications, and you can filter by application type. And in this case, it's in-flight applications for the type. And again, you can find the expiry dates for each listed authorization, and of course, the latest application date for authorization holders to submit a review report. So I have now given you information on where to find the key dates if you use a chemical on the authorization list, or your supply chain relies on use by your suppliers. In the next slides, I will give you some information on where you can find information on potential future entries on the authorization list. So next slide, please. So Steve already touched upon this. So this gives some information on how new entries may be added to the UK authorization list. So it's really important to keep in mind that the EU and UK authorization lists are now separate lists, and they will diverge as different entries are added to both lists. we can see that there is already divergence in the lists, as 5 new entries were added to the EU list in April this year. So the EU list has now 59 entries, while the UK list still has the 54 that were taken from the EU list on the 1st of January 2021. How are new entries added? So basically any chemical that has SVHC status is a candidate for future inclusion on the authorization list. 15 additional entries were added to the EU SVHC list since January 2021, but these were not added to the UK list. 8 additional entries have been proposed by ECHA for inclusion on the authorization list, but so far only 2, a specific phthalate and a specific borate, were recommended by the UK HSE for inclusion on the UK authorization list. So basically the Commission and the UK Secretary of State may not include the same entries on their respective lists. So how does it work in practice? So the HSE may recommend chemicals that have SVHC status, and the appropriate authorities, which would be DEFRA, with the consent of the devolved governments in Scotland and Wales, they will decide whether to include these entries ultimately on the authorization list. So I mentioned that the UK and EU authorization lists already diverge. In the next slide, I will give you some info on likely future divergence. So next slide, please. So this slide looks on possible divergences between EU and UK authorization processes over the next 5 years. So today there are really a lot of similarities between EU and UK REACH authorization processes. The lists have 54 entries in common. The application process follows the same logic: submission, assessment, opinion making, decision taking, granting, refusal, and time limited authorizations. In the next 1 to 2 years, there's some more divergences likely as different entries are added to respective lists. However, in the next 2 to 5 years, it's possible that there will be potentially massive divergence due to the ongoing reform of the EU authorization process under the EU Chemical Strategy for Sustainability. The process will ultimately be changed, and there will be a period of transition between the old EU process and whatever comes in the new EU process. To date, we have no indication on how the UK government will react. So it may be that for a couple of years, or for many years, we will see that under EU REACH, we have an authorization process 2.0, while under UK REACH, authorization 1.0 is maintained for a period of time. So that concludes my overview of the UK application process. In the next agenda point, I will share some observations on the differences in the assessment approaches taken by the UK HSE compared with the ECHA committees for applications that were submitted to both processes. So next slide, please. So this is our agenda point for these case study observations. So next slide again, please. So on this slide, I give the background for how we can compare the assessments done by the UK HSE and the ECHA committees for the same applications. So as I explained earlier, many EU applications with GB-based users were in flight as on the 1st of January 2021. So those that fulfill the criteria for transitional arrangements submitted applications for GB uses or GB users during the 18-month period. That meant in effect that the same applications were submitted under both EU and UK REACH authorization processes. So it's interesting to have a look at similarities and differences in terms of how the assessment was done and the outcomes of the assessments. In particular now, as the first decisions are available for applications submitted under UK REACH. So our example case study is the application submitted for uses of chemicals covered by entries 42 and 43. So these are the octylphenyl and nonyl phenyl ethoxylates. They are very widely used detergents, in particular in the IVD and pharma sectors. The properties of concern that these detergents have are endocrine disrupting properties. So just to say that the details on the slides are taken from publicly available information from the ECHA and UK website. So all the information I will show you is publicly available, and you can also find it directly on the websites. Next slide, please. So first we look at the assessment done on the applications submitted under EU REACH. More than, I think, 100 applications were submitted for use of these detergents. So first, the ECHA Risk Assessment Committee published its opinion on risk-related considerations for applications for authorisation. So they consider that these detergents are non-threshold substances and that a predicted no-effect concentration level, or PNEC, cannot be derived, meaning that there is no safe use emission level. Their opinion stated that the exposure assessment in applications for authorisation will need to consider the appropriateness and the effectiveness of operating conditions and risk management measures in place to minimise releases to the environment. If we look at the ECHA Committee assessment of the applications received, we see that the Risk Assessment Committee focused solely on releases to the environment, so really kilograms released to the aquatic compartment coming from the use, and the measures in place to minimise these emissions. The Socioeconomic Analysis Committee, the cost-benefit analysis was based on the cost of avoided emissions. The ECHA Committee opinions and the Commission decisions are now available for tens of these applications. And on the next slide, I will give you information on the conditions of use that were imposed on the users. Next slide, please. So this slide summarises the outcome of the assessment done under the EU process for these applications on the octylphenyl and nonyl phenyl, for uses of octylphenyl and nonyl phenyl ethoxylates. So in general, we can see from the EU authorisation decisions that the applicants generally got the review periods they requested. So generally they got long review periods, but that conditions of use were imposed on the authorisation holders and their downstream users to collect all detergent containing waste for adequate treatment. So this was consistent with a non-threshold approach taken in the risk characterisation, i.e. there is no safe emission level. So on this slide, I have shown a screenshot of an authorisation decision showing this condition of use. I have to say that this condition was discussed intensely and was quite unpopular with the users, but it is in effect in probably all of the ECHA Committee opinions and likely almost all of the Commission decisions. So in the next slide, I will share with you details of quite a different approach that was taken by the UK HSE in their assessment of the same applications. So next slide, please. So this slide gives information on how the UK HSE assessed these applications. There was no specific information available from the UK HSE on how to derive risk, and the applications were submitted following essentially the same approach as for EU REACH. However, now that the first agency opinions and decisions are available, we can see that the UK HSE assessment approach was quite different. So in contrast to the EU assessment, the HSE concluded that safe use could be demonstrated by comparing the predicted environmental concentrations with environmental quality standards, or EQSs, proposed for ethinyl estradiol, or EE2 for short, an endocrine disruptor with the same estrogenic mode of action. So the HSE conclusion given in the opinion and in the authorisation decision says that residual emissions coming from the use would not result in discernible environmental impacts on wildlife in the receiving surface waters. And critically, no conditions of use were recommended or imposed to collect all wastewater. So the first agency opinions and decisions are becoming available, so it will be interesting to follow trends in the assessments between the UK and the EU processes. So will they reach the same assessment outcomes? Well, how much will they differ? So in the next slide, I will give you a state of play from the perspective of the regulator and of the users, so in terms of how it's going in practice. So next slide, please. So if we look at the state of play from the perspective of the regulator, in this case, the UK HSE, charged with the implementation of the process, we can say that the status is so far so good. The process is up and running. There are no delays. There is no dedicated IT system, but it's not creating delays for the moment. A low number of applications were submitted to date, but numbers are expected to increase significantly with the expiry of review periods. So it will be also interesting to see how they cope with the increased numbers. We also can see that they will have some interesting challenges ahead. So for example, how will they process upstream applications? Will these quite unloved applications have a harder or easier time to get through the process? Will the UK HSE be more willing to refuse authorisation? So the EU process so far has only refused a handful out of the 200 or so that have been processed so far. What happens if a pending EU application is ultimately refused? And this may happen early next year, so it will be interesting to see if the UK HSE feels it must take action or not. And similarly, what happens if an upstream application authorization is annulled by the European Court of Justice? And we do have this situation too, so this will also likely happen early next year. And there again, it will be interesting to see if the UK HSE feels they must also react in some way. So lots of interesting challenges ahead. On the next slide, we look at the state of play from the perspective of the users. So next slide, please. So from the perspective of the users, we can see that it's been quite a complex situation for users, in particular those who were covered by an EU application or authorization, and they perhaps had not been following the application process too closely. And also we see that there may not have been a lot of awareness that an EU authorization is not valid in GB and vice versa. So if you're relying on an upstream application that is now an EU application, it is not going to cover you ultimately in GB. And we're also seeing that the relevance of key dates may not be well understood by the users. So a lot of confusion between sunset dates and expiry of review periods. So, but this is still early days for the UK REACH authorization process, and we will learn more as more applications are submitted and more applications are processed. So that concludes my 2 agenda points, and now I will hand the floor back to Steve for the conclusions.
Thank you very much, Bernadette. So, next slide, please. So the UK authorization system is designed to continue existing EU authorizations applications, but all new authorizations in Great Britain since January 2021 are approved by UK authorities. Our early experience shows authorities are very interested in technical detail of the chemical control of chemicals. Now that might be due because the UK had its control of substances hazardous to health or COSH legislation before REACH, and we have a suspicion that it may come from the prior culture of risk, business-based risk assessment and management decision making. And obviously the existing country system of environmental permits will also give it a flavour. So the UK authorities have their way of doing things. It is not subject to a committee process, a multinational committee process as we see at ECHA. And that may be the biggest difference in terms of how REACH and authorization in particular in the UK is managed differently. COSH is perhaps more risk-based and pragmatic rather than hazard-based, so it gives a slightly different perspective from the authority's point of view. Nonetheless, authorization is a serious process. Preparation is absolutely vital, and the same questions whether you are in the EU or in Great Britain are the same. So if you're sure you cannot substitute, well, why not? You need to know that, otherwise there's no point in trying to apply for authorization. And you will also need to be able to substantiate the economic benefits and impacts and get data on use, exposure and emissions to defend the case. Now, some of that data on use and exposure may not necessarily be readily available because risk-based exposure monitoring is generally the case in Great Britain and is not the same system as is in the case in many other countries across Europe. So it requires preparation, and it may require data that does not yet exist in order to defend the case. So we'll move on to some Q&A. We've received 2 questions in advance and 1 during today. So please get any other questions in, and you know, we need to test Bernadette with her knowledge, demonstrate her expert knowledge of the subject, I think. At the moment, we've got some high-level ones which I'll deal with whilst you get your detailed questions for Bernadette in. So next slide, please. So the 2 questions we received in advance. Next slide, please, Ingrid. Thank you. So are you considering lead only an SVHC in the UK but recommended for authorization in the EU? So just to clarify the position, Lead was in the candidate list prior to the UK exiting the EU system. So it is also in the candidate list in the UK. Now, in the European system, ECHA make recommendations based on a range of risk-based criteria, including widespread use, significant volumes, and so on and so forth, which lead meets. And so according to their process, they included it in a recommendation to be added into the authorization list in the EU, but it has gone no further. Some people may know that I've been arguing that it's unlikely ever to get into the authorization list in the EU, simply because the practicability of managing all the authorizations implied will be so horrendous. Lead is a low-level concentration in many alloys and metals, simply because it's there, not because it's required, but it would be economically too difficult to purify the metals further, and is often a casting or alloying aid for those metals. So it will be a very big challenge to manage authorization of lead in the EU, and therefore I have long suspected that lead will never get onto Annex 14. But I may be proven wrong. Look out. The next one we had is not an authorization question, so I'll very, very briefly cover it. Do we know when the situation is going to be clarified by UK authorities about UK REACH implementation? Unless I'm mistaken, as of today, it looks like it's stuck to June, but nobody knows when and how to register a substance. For clarity, any substance that is new to the UK market that has never been registered in the EU before has to be registered in full before it comes onto the UK market greater than 1 ton a year. Everything else is subject to deferred registration, either through grandfathering or new registration of an existing substance, or through a downstream user importer notification or DUIP. At that point, co-registration applies, and the registration dates are currently 2023, 2025, or 2027. There is a consultation ongoing which should report imminently, proposing to change those registration dates whilst the authorities consider a lower impact data model for registrations in the UK for substances already registered in the EU. But that's been a long process. It is certain the authorities are going to change the dates, but legally the dates are as in the legislation, the first of which is October next year. So that's the situation. It should be changed. It isn't just doing. It depends on who you are and what chemical you're dealing with, and it's really a registration question. So I'm going to move on. We've received one question today so far. Please keep them coming in. That question is, if a component article, for example, a spring within a trigger spray bottle, contains greater than 0.1% of an SVHC on the candidate list, how would safe use be communicated to satisfy Article 33? Would the SVHC need to be labelled on the trigger pack? I'm going to first clarify the question. Essentially, there are two types of Article 33 reporting. One is between businesses, and one is business to a consumer. A business-to-business relationship, then the supplier of the spring has an obligation to report SVHCs to the spray bottle manufacturer in this case. And then the trigger spray bottle manufacturer, assuming it's a retail item, can have it sold within a store, and then the retailer has an obligation to report SVHCs on request within 45 days free of charge. That's an Article 33 Part 2 notification. So it depends on the context. So one is automatic obligation, the other one is on request. Other than that, no formats or requirements are there other than safe use communication as a minimum of the name of the substance. So there's no prescribed process or format or standard. It depends on the industry, and what I would always suggest is the customer is asked what format is appropriate. So the spring manufacturer asks the trigger spray bottle manufacturer, how do you want this information? This trigger spray bottle manufacturer, if they are importing the spring from outside the UK in this case, or outside the EU for the EU, then the obligation is on them anyway. Either way, contractually flow down the obligation to provide the data. I think everything else is probably beyond the scope of this webinar. Any other questions, please? I'll just wait 20 seconds to see if there are any more questions. So far, no more questions have been submitted. So I'll just wait 30 seconds and then let everyone go. Okay. I'm going to assume that's quite quiet on the question side. Thank you very much for your attention. If you are in London next week, come and see us at our stand. Thank you very much, everyone. Here are some contact informations. You can get them on terms of the video of this webinar, which will be released in due course on our YouTube channel. Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you for Bernadette for helping me today and Ingrid for operating the slides in the background. Thank you very much.